Guardians of the Round Table 1, Dexterity Fail, written by Avril, Sabine, Storm Petersen and Rhys Petersen. Dedication. For all those gamers who also love to read. And especially for Brad and Will, amongst the first to read this book. Book description. When all actions have repercussions, it isn't really a game. Mallory's brother brings home the wrong game disc. His latest disaster doesn't surprise her one little bit. What does surprise her is being transported to a role-playing style world when they check out the plain black disc. When you're a noob in a world you don't understand, death is always imminent. They aren't sure if they want to leave Inadon, even if they can figure out a way to return home. But they do know they need to either get good or they're likely to learn what happens when a player runs out of revives. Chapter 1. Mallory paced back and forth on the patio, the concrete warm under her bare feet, the cordless phone held to her ear. "He's stuffing his face, Mum." Her gaze scanned the street for her brother, not seeing him. It was a good thing she'd come up with an excuse on the way home. When she'd arrived, she'd barely managed to change out of her school uniform and into jeans and a t-shirt, before the phone had rung. "Put him on the phone," Noreen said. "What do you expect him to do? Knock 3 times like some ghost at a seance?" Mallory spotted her brother running down the street, his school bag bouncing on his back, an item wrapped in brown paper in his hand. When the bus had dropped them at the local shopping center after school, he dashed off promising he wouldn't be long. Obviously, his definition of long was different to hers. She stopped on the edge of the patio, mentally urging him to hurry. "Are you covering for Brody again? Why would I bother? He's so annoying." She glared at the grin Brody gave her as he joined her on the patio. "He's such a pig. He stuffed so much food in his mouth he can't shut it. Disgusting." Noreen sighed. "Tell him to hurry up. My break is nearly over and I'll have to get back to work. I shouldn't have to ring and check on the 2 of you each afternoon. I should be able to rely on you to go straight home after school." Brody held out his hand, the item wrapped in brown paper clutched in the other. "Here he is." Mallory handed over the phone, meeting her brother's green eyes, identical to her own. "You owe me." She mouthed the words, not wanting to risk their mum hearing. If anything, he owed her for having to put up with all the afternoon phone calls. They were his fault. Brody grinned, shrugging as he took the phone. "Hey Mum." He wandered inside, his short brown hair damp from sweat. Not bothering to remove his sneakers, he dropped his backpack in the walkway. Mallory lifted her brown hair up from around her shoulders, the day surprisingly warm for late February in Brisbane. It was more like North Queensland weather. Where her brother's hair was a plain brown, hers was naturally streaked with copper highlights. Letting her hair fall back around her shoulders, she caught sight of the curtain in the house across the road, twitching. She was half tempted to wave at Mrs. Torres, the neighborhood gossip. If it hadn't been for that old woman, her mum wouldn't have known Brody had gone out instead of coming home after school. And she wouldn't have been in trouble for covering for him. What did their mum expect? It wasn't like they were little kids. What was wrong with going out with mates of an afternoon? Stifling the urge to wave, she headed inside, closing the front door, which led into a lounge room. The timber floorboards were cool and smooth beneath her bare feet. A curtain was drawn at the single window overlooking the side yard, and colorful cushions were scattered across the lounge suite, that was set in a semicircle in front of the large, flat-screen television. A console sat on the cabinet beside the television, several game cases scattered around it. Seeing her brother had finished on the phone, she demanded, "What were you thinking? 3 days in a row I've had to come up with excuses for why you can't come to the phone, and it's only Wednesday. You better not think I'm going to do this for the rest of the week." He probably would, and she was running out of believable excuses. Brody grinned, tearing open the brown paper to reveal a game case. "You should be getting good at it." He frowned. "This isn't my game." He turned a black case back and forth, looking at the front and back several times before opening it. You do know that getting it wrapped in brown paper doesn't disguise the shape. Mrs. Torres will mention to Mum that you bought another game. Which you're not meant to do until your school results improve. She'll end up banning you from playing games altogether if you're not careful. Brody stared at the disc in the open case. It was a black disc with no image or writing across the surface. That man must have my game. What man? Some stupid man who ran into me when I was coming out of the game shop. Ran into you, or you ran into him? Mallory was pretty certain it was the second option. If it hadn't been for him, I wouldn't have been late. I had to help him pick up all the stuff he dropped. Now he's probably got my game and I'm stuck with something that doesn't have a label. The front door opened and a lanky figure entered, momentarily silhouetted by the light, before he closed the door. Did you get it? His sneakers squeaked against the timber floor. Mallory sighed. She'd get no sense out of her brother now Callum had arrived. They talk car racing games. Not her kind of game at all. She gestured towards the case her brother held. Apparently he lost it and ended up with some other game. At least she guessed it was a game. With its plain case and lack of images, it could be anything. She'd only assumed it was a game due to the type of case it came in. Callum took the disc from Brody. You're kidding. How did that happen? Think about it, Mallory said dryly. Brody. Walking disaster. She returned Callum's grin. At 17, he was the same age as her and a year older than her brother. When he'd first started hanging out with Brody, about 18 months ago when he'd moved in next door, she'd worried it was because he was trying to meet her. It wouldn't have been the first time that had happened. It hadn't taken her long to figure out that Callum wasn't interested in girls. Nor interested in her brother that way. I'm not that bad, Brody argued. Mallory met Callum's dark eyes again, laughing when he raised an eyebrow. I'm not, Brody muttered. The front door opened again and the tall figure who entered this time filled the doorway far better than Callum had. He left the door open, remaining just inside, his eyes as dark as Callum's, his black hair tied at the nape of his neck while Callum's equally dark hair was kept short. Dad said to get back home and deal with the rubbish. If you miss getting the bin out for collection day again, you'll be grounded for a month. His attention was caught by the game Callum held. That doesn't look like the new car game you and Callum have been talking about all month. He took the disc and examined it closely. Shut the door, Ryan, Mallory said. We don't need Mrs. Torres thinking it's time to resort to her binoculars. Ryan chuckled, closing the door, coming further inside, his boots loud on the timber floor. You want to give her something to really gossip about? He met Mallory's gaze, mischief in his dark eyes. Well? What do you say? Sure, she said dryly, knowing he didn't mean it. Last year she'd tentatively tried to ask him out to the movies, but he'd brushed her off saying, "Got other plans, kid." She doubted a year was long enough that he suddenly saw her as more than a kid. Not that 19 was all that much older than her. Callum took the game off Ryan. We should see what sort of game it is. What happened to the car game you were buying? Ryan asked. He lost it, Mallory said. Ryan chuckled. Should have known there'd have been some sort of disaster. It wasn't my fault, Brody complained, launching into a spiel about the old man who'd run into him. Old man? He's aging by the minute. Mallory took the game from Callum. Let's see what old men like to play. Okay, so he wasn't that old. He was Mum's age or something. Brody stepped in front of the console. We don't even know if that disc is the right format. Mallory pushed her brother aside, not bothering to point out that their mum wouldn't be impressed by being called old, since she was only 45. One way to find out if it'll work. Could be a PC game, Callum said. Or for a different console, Ryan suggested. Mallory inserted the disc, turning on the television while she waited for the game to load. She grabbed one of the controllers that was sitting beside the console, turning it on too. It black-screened. You better not have broken it. Brody reached for the console. Mallory pushed his hand away. Give it a minute. She gave one of the other controllers to her brother. Go sit down or something. Ryan nodded to the controller Brody held. It might not be a multiplayer game. Something's happening. Callum gestured towards the screen.